All right, everybody, this is In Liberty and Health. I'm back today with a very special guest who I'm very excited to have on. We unexpectedly are twinning. We're both wearing the same hat. I was going to wait to see if you noticed, but I couldn't help it. I noticed he was wearing it and I had to say something first. So I got Robb Wolf with me today. How you doing, brother?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
Of course. No, I'm super stoked. I also have to put this out there. Your electrolytes probably saved my life on my carnivore journey when I started about 2 years ago. I've since gone off for about 6 months now and reintroduced some carbohydrates and some other stuff. But I remember dealing with the digestive issues, energy issues, and I started intermittent fasting and taking electrolytes, and that was like night and day, and it was a real game changer for me. They're delicious, and I still use them all the time to this day, even though I'm consuming about probably 200 to 250 grams of carbs a day. I can't get enough of them.
Yeah. It's been an interesting ride with that stuff. I would have never thought that there was kind of a blue ocean hidden in the Red Sea of electrolytes and
Mhm.
sports drinks and all that stuff, but we appear to have found one. So and yeah, I'm stoked it's working well for you. And don't forget, with the holidays, like, it makes a hell of a cocktail drink mixer most of the time too. So you
You
can
know,
you can get double duty.
I love the mango chili. I'm pretty sure when I was in Ocean City and I kind of went no bars hold and just, fried cheesecake, you name it, I was face down in all the junk food you could possibly imagine. I'm pretty sure at a couple times I had the lemon habanero electrolytes and I put those in a couple margaritas, and it was pretty fucking good,
It'll pull
actually.
you back from the brink. Yeah, it's pretty legit. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I guess on a personal note, have you ever taken those in the morning after? Because people always tell you when you're hungover, you need to drink Gatorade because of the
Hmm.
electrolytes. And the electrolytes, it's like a pinch of salt that's in Gatorade versus your electrolytes, which are real electrolytes.
Right.
Um, have you actually found that to be helpful?
I mean, this is as anecdotal as it gets,
Sure.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
there's no randomized control trial on this, and I don't even know how you could like standardize for severity of a
Spring
hangover,
break.
but yeah, I mean, if I'm doing, I mean, just in general, that's kind of more. I'll use something like that as a base for whatever I'm drinking. I don't,
Yeah.
I'm allergic to wheat, so I can't really do beer. And then I'll do a little bit of wine, which wine will. I'm almost 50 now, and wine will kick my ass pretty good. But I
Mhm.
do notice that if I have some electrolytes after having that, and then potentially the following day, like it's dramatically better. It's not as impactful. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you could get like some Kahlua and put some chocolate electrolytes in there, right?
Yeah, yes, and that is one of our recommended like holiday
Oh,
beverage
really?
options. Yeah, yeah,
Nice.
yeah. You
Ah,
nailed that one. Yeah,
oh yeah, I didn't even think about that, but hell yeah, I'll have to try that sometime. Do an Irish car bomb or something like that.
yep.
Now, Irish car bombs are straight and total gut bombs. Jesus Christ, I hadn't had those in forever, and I think last time I had one, I'm pretty sure I ended up puking. So yeah, it's bad. How did you come to the realization that electrolytes were like a thing and important? Because I remember hearing you on different shows saying like, "Hey, I salt my food," and I've kind of helped people through their carnivore journey as well as somebody who did it for 2 years and was performing at, I would say, more athletically than most. Um, it seems like, hey, yeah, I salt the hell out of my food and maybe I eat some seafood, so I should get enough there. But I don't think people understand that the human body does feel a lot better, especially in a low carb situation with a little bit more salt. So, what was kind of like, how did you find out that that was so important?
Well, I flailed for the better part of 20 years, and then I asked some people who were smarter than I am about this, and my friends Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, they're the co-founders of both Element, but then this online training program called Keto Gains, and they just work with hundreds of thousands of people doing these ketogenic diet, body composition reset things, and the results they get are just amazing. They have people doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu and CrossFit and all kinds of high level stuff. I'm like, how are they doing this? And I kind of stalked those guys and had them look at what I was doing. And when they looked at what I was eating, they're like, your protein, carbs, fat are fine, but you're probably super deficient in electrolytes, but specifically sodium. And I said, oh, no, no, I'm sure that's fine. I salt my food. And like their head probably almost rolled off their shoulders from rolling their eyes so hard, because they've heard this 1,000, 10,000 times. And
Yeah.
so it took about a year more of me struggling and flailing around and then patiently just saying, no, you probably need more sodium. And then one day it was literally like, hey, man, just grab some pickle juice, take a big swig of it, and then go do your training and tell us how it goes. I'm like, oh my God, like that way I had the low gear. I didn't have that like super just like stressed feeling of like trying to dig so deep. Like I actually felt like more like I had carbs or something, because I tend to eat pretty low carb too, which is great for my cognition and historically hasn't been fantastic for my athletic performance. And once we figured that out, we one, I was like, oh my God, electrolytes are important. And they're like, yes, you're an idiot. And we've known this for 10 years, welcome to the club, basically. And when I looked out at the community that I serve and then the folks that they serve, I was like, why don't we do some sort of free guide for this, And so we made this keto aid thing, and it's this much salt, this much no salt, which is the potassium chloride, some magnesium citrate, lemon juice, stevia, water, shake it up. There you go. And we didn't even have like an email, requirement to get it. Just posted it up, and within 4 months, we had like 500,000 downloads of this thing, and it was just going like crazy, And we started getting tagged on social media where folks were like, "Oh, love the keto aid. I feel so much better. But when I travel, TSA doesn't like my 3 bags of white powder, And so, could you guys do some sort of a stick pack deal or something?" And so that was really the whole, like the superficially, but the whole story of the company. I figured out that I was being an idiot and not getting enough sodium. I realized that a ton of the people that I tried to serve were in a similar boat. And so we did this freemium offering to try to help people, and it went like gangbusters, and then it was actually the folks that were getting benefit from the keto aid that gave us the idea, why don't you do an electrolyte drink, And so we did that. Like 5 years ago, I had no thought that I was going to be, a salt peddler or something like that. But that, here I am now.
Yeah, I was thinking about it earlier. I was going to introduce you as the saltiest man on earth, but that could kind of go up in the air. Um, I heard Zach Bitter once talk about this, but actually, it might have been when you were on his show. But I think you guys were talking about how important sodium is, and looking at sodium on a low carb diet almost is like your carbohydrate intake, because it can be that kind of performance enhancer almost. Where if you listen to someone like James DeNicola Antonio, hopefully I said that right,
Yep.
he says if you take, I think it's 2 tablespoons of salt pre-workout, that increases blood volume within like a half hour or so. And my anecdotal experience of that as a guy who's been lifting now consistently for about 10 years is that if I do, you know, do some salt a little bit before my workout, that does make a huge difference. And especially when I was lower carb, that did make a world's difference. So, have you kind of found that to be the case, that salt is key in kind of performance on low carb?
Yeah, on low carb, but even at higher carb levels, depending on the activity,
Hmm.
volume, duration, heat, humidity. So the American Council of Sports Medicine, ACSM, their guideline for athletes is 7 to 10 grams of sodium per day, depending on activity level, heat, humidity, those sorts of things. So even and that's within a very high carb, fueled environment, like they're
Hmm.
typically catering to that. But I would just say that any amount of cleaning up your diet and decreasing the glycemic load is going to just compound that need for sure. Yeah, because when we have a base level, if you're eating a higher carb diet, your insulin levels tend to be a bit higher, and we tend to retain sodium better, so we retain that fluid balance a little bit better. But and for some people that's great, other people that's problematic. And so if you eat on the lower carb side of things, then we tend to lose sodium more easily, and so you have to supplement it to be able to stay ahead of that whole process.
Okay, so to kind of dumb it down, then I think the way it is, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but because glycogen holds water, the water holds sodium, and there's also aldosterone in there. And when you're on a lower carb diet, you're mostly depleted because you're not getting a frequent feeding of carbohydrates, which replenish your glycogen stores. So that's why you need the sodium to, because you're losing more sodium through your urine because it's not being held in water or glycogen, correct?
For the most part, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for the most part. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So I feel a little bit smarter now because I like would learn about this, I'd forget it, learn about it, forget it, learn about it, forget it. But yeah, that's all good stuff. So what does 7 to 10 grams kind of look like? Would that be 7 to 10 packets of the electrolytes, or to the lay person, what does that look like?
Yeah. So we're not recommending that folks do 7 to 10 packets. I
Sure.
mean, if you do,
Yeah.
that's fine. But ideally, we're trying to get people to eat salt-rich foods in these scenarios. So like 10 olives has a gram of sodium, 1,000 milligrams of sodium.
Okay.
2 ounces of good quality salami has a gram of sodium. I mean, there's some good quality foods that are also pretty salt rich. Like smoked almonds that are salted. Like you can get a really good whack of sodium from that as well. So just measurement wise, 1 teaspoon of table salt is about a gram of sodium. It's not perfect, but it's right in the neighborhood. So that's what we're talking about from like just a volumetric perspective, and then from just different food perspective. There's a lot of different foods that are good for you. Like pickles are rich in sodium. Pickle juice is super rich in sodium. It's kind of hard to gauge exactly how much you get with that, but it's a guarantee. It's quite high in sodium. So those are all good options to fill in that stuff. So we'd like to see as much of the sodium, potassium, magnesium obtained from diet as possible. But then oftentimes people find themselves in a scenario where they need to supplement it. And that's where something like Element or doing our Keto Aid, we still have that free downloadable guide online for people to do that.
Okay. Um, I've always been kind of curious about the ancestral health perspective of this, and that kind of gets thrown around a lot, and I definitely want to hit on that too. But to kind of, I guess, get us going down this rabbit hole, um, do you think the reason why our bodies are, perform better on a higher sodium, intake is because we would have eaten more meat that was fresher, which would have more blood, which would have more sodium in it, and now most of the meat that we get is typically dry aged or something like that, and that's why we're not getting as much salt. I know that's pretty abstract
No, no,
almost, and
no.
it's pretty
I
far
think that you're,
back.
I think, honestly, I think point number one is that Paleo man didn't have one of these with him or her all the time, coffee, tea, water, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think just the volume of fluid we drink is kind of discordant with what is healthier for us. Like we wouldn't necessarily need to supplement as much sodium as we do if we didn't drink as much beverage as we do, I think is a baseline.
Okay,
There
yeah.
is this reality though, that if you look at the sodium distribution in most mammals, there's about two grams of sodium per kilogram of mammal stuff. It's like hair and skin and nails and the whole deal. And it's not equally distributed. There's more in the bones, and it's sometimes in the skin and nails than there is within the muscle and whatnot. But it's fairly uniformly distributed. And what we find, due to the modern butchering practices, when an animal is killed, it's bled. And so there is higher concentrations of sodium extracellular than there is intracellular. So in the blood and the plasma, there's higher sodium concentrations. When an organism dies, one of the things that occurs is that the sodium goes into the cells and the potassium goes out of the cells. And this is actually part of the beginning of the breakdown process. And we want some of this stuff to occur in like aged meat and stuff like that. But you could make the case that most meat products would have been at least double in the amount of sodium that we get. In an average kilogram of meat provides about a gram of sodium. So so you could easily double that there, but that's still quite a ways off of what we're talking about with this kind of modern intake. And I think another piece to that is if we really want to get kind of paleo reenactment, our forebears were very active, but they weren't professional athletes. Like they weren't doing jujitsu 5 days a week and 2 hours of doing that. They're pretty smart about the timing of doing hunting and gathering. Although humans are great at endurance running compared to other animals, particularly in the heat, you didn't do that every day. It's like you might do it a day, you have success, and then you rest it a lot, and so I just think that some of the need for additional sodium is reflected in our modern lifestyle. Like I think for the people who exercise, they typically exercise more than what most hunter gatherers, even contemporarily
Right.
studied, do, you know,
Right.
and
Yeah.
under circumstances, yeah,
Your average
yeah,
paleo guy probably wasn't hammering out a 500-pound deadlift every single day and then squatting 300 pounds. His activity was more so I'm chasing this down, and it's not a long drawn out process. It's a short period of a lot of exertion and then rest, eat, recover, and then walk for a while. Nothing like it looks today, or at least
right.
that's how I kind of see it.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean we also know that within Neolithic times, salt was a super early traded commodity. Like the term salt comes from salary, which is the way the Roman army was paid in
Right.
salt. And it's probably not like we do know that in Paleolithic times there were different trade economies that occurred around bone and shells and different things. And it's hard to imagine that there wasn't, at least in different areas, some type of an economy trading salt. I mean, we didn't have pottery, so the container would have probably been some sort of like a leather bag type deal. So it'd be hard to find that stuff. But I mean, it's fungible and easily
Yeah.
distributable and all that type of stuff. So I mean, and then there's some part of the human evolution theory that the aquatic ape theory, which is that humans generally moved around the world first via the coastline. So we would have had access to salt and salty foods, pretty ubiquitously, and then, entering more inland after that. But there's salt licks and salt flats in a number of areas. So I do think that there are places where that could get plugged in. Trade within people could have supplemented that. But then I think the more, stronger things to stand on are just we didn't have water bottles with us 24/7 and 32-ounce cups of coffee and stuff like that to
Yeah.
dilute the sodium that gets us into this low sodium environment to start
Mhm.
off with. Yeah.
Right. So, does coffee actually make you lose sodium? Because I know it's like a I don't want to say a hot debated topic, but you hear from some people, yeah, it's a mild diuretic. You hear from some people, yeah, you lose a lot of sodium if you drink a lot of caffeine. What's the what's
if
the
you
nuance there?
if one is habituated to caffeine, it's not really a diuretic. And
Okay.
so it's not really a problem. And the main issue there either way is just that it if we consume a large bolus of fluid without electrolytes, or we didn't say, like, if I ate a meal that was salami, pickles, and olives, and say like I got 3 grams of sodium out of that, then I could sip on a lot of water to be
Mhm.
able to reach an equilibrium with where my electrolytes should be relative to the hydration. But if we're not doing that, then you take this thing, it's like a 20-ounce container, and I just shoot that down, I'm going to dilute my sodium specifically, both the sodium and potassium. It kind of gets diluted, but sodium is the more concerning part. And so then the body needs to start using the kidneys to excrete fluid, and usually it excretes potassium in addition to the sodium going out. So you end up losing some of everything in the process of trying to get it back down to normal. Because if we dilute think about it like this: the two arguably most tightly regulated physiological processes are pH and electrolytes. If those things go up or down just a little bit, we get sick or potentially die. And so the body really works quite hard to make sure that both pH and electrolytes are very tightly controlled.
Hmm. All right. Well, I guess kind of tailoring on to nutrition and stuff like that. Do you feel like there's a fine line between trying to optimize muscle protein synthesis versus longevity? Like, do you think you can have both to a fair degree without compromising one or the other, because a lot of people talk about, well, you should eat multiple protein boluses a day so that way you get the maximum amount of muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. And then, there's also a lot of evidence around, okay, well, you might want to intermittent fast, maybe eat like a bigger breakfast and then like an early dinner or maybe even a late lunch, so that way your gut is freed up when you're sleeping because you're able to sleep better on an empty stomach. And I know there's more science that I'm letting on here,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
do you feel like there's a way that we could do both? Because right now, the way that I'm doing things right now, I'm kind of reverse dieting, so I'm trying to add on as much lean mass as possible and build up my metabolism for probably about 6 months or so, right? Because I'm getting married next year in November, so I don't want to get super shredded right now and then have to maintain that and then eat 1,800 calories into a wedding.
To
I,
maintain, yeah, yeah,
right. I would
right.
rather put on a little bit of body fat right now, but also put on some muscle and then cut down for a little bit and then reverse back into the wedding so that way my metabolism is a good place. So that's kind of a long way to ask. Do you feel like we can kind of turn these levers to get the best of both worlds, or do you feel like you kind of have to choose one rabbit or the other to chase?
No, so God, how do I want to tackle this? Right before COVID nuked the world, I had this talk that I only got to do publicly once, and it was at the Metabolic Health Summit, and the title is "Longevity, Are We Trying Too Hard?" And in that, I dig into things like mTOR, intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, and I wrote my first published article on intermittent fasting in 2005,
I
and
love
by
this story.
2006, I deeply regretted releasing that article. Like, it was just a fucking shit show, it mainly went out to the CrossFit scene. These CrossFit folks are already so type A and over the top, and it was just burning people out. It was accentuating the burnout. People that were only eating 5 grams of carbs a month were eating in a 22-hour compressed window, and it's like, oh my god, like, this maybe 16-hour fast would probably be good for a computer programmer who walks and maybe lifts weights once in a while, but a twice a day training CrossFit Games person is like, this is an absolute disaster. And so that really started. What I noticed was that it was at best a coin toss whether or not intermittent fasting helped people. Some people, they were just like, I noticed that I can just go longer without meals and I don't have to be neurotic about like the 6 meals a day. Like, I don't lose some muscle mass. If I skip a meal or 2 meals, then I make it up later and it's no big deal. Like, it's not like I go into negative nitrogen balance immediately and there's this problem. So the biggest upside that I found was that it seemed to streamline some people's lives, but literally 50% of people, it seemed to contribute to tanking their hormones, retrograde performance, loss of muscle mass, and all that type of stuff. So I started. I don't know if I took a more critical, look at it, but I think it fostered that, and I started asking some deeper questions. Like, so does calorie restriction work in an organism that is fed a species appropriate diet? And there's a great paper, calorie restriction does not extend lifespan in all organisms and is unlikely to do so in humans, is the title. And it gets in and it looks, there's not a ton of studies, but like mice and rats are cited oftentimes as these study animals where they feed them 40% less than they would eat ad libitum, that they would eat on their own. And the animal lives longer and has lower rates of cancer and cardiovascular disease and all this stuff. And it's really impressive until you look at what happens with calorie restriction when you feed mice a species appropriate diet. Like, actually, instead of feeding them, like, so the lab chow diet is basically sugar, whey protein, vegetable oils, vitamins, minerals, and binders to make these pellets to stick together. And the reason why scientists do this is you can, in that circumstance, know exactly how much and what types of food an animal is eating. If it's in a box and you weigh out that much of the food, and the error bars of the way the food is manufactured, and you put the food in and then you take the leftovers out, like, you've got a really good sense of how much they're eating. So it's great for that. But you're feeding these animals junk food, like super shitty junk food. And it's well understood that it's almost impossible to feed these animals in a way that doesn't cause disease. Like you have to mildly calorie restrict them to just not make them obese for the most part. So what's been missing in this whole, when they fed these animals a species appropriate diet and calorie restricted them, it shortened their lifespan. It didn't increase it. When they just fed these animals a species appropriate diet in a lab setting, they had almost as much increase in longevity as what they did with calorie restriction, but without all the gnarly side effects and everything. So people are really geeked out about like suppressing mTOR and all these, supposed benefits around fasting, but they're always comparing this to people or organisms that are sick, overweight, and metabolically broken. Like, of course, if you're eating too much of a shitty diet, eating less of it is going to be better. Like
Yeah.
this should be obvious, but it actually took me a long time to arrive at that. The question here needs to be, what does the longevity, the health span and the lifespan of an organism look like if it is lean, active, strong, and metabolically healthy? And then how does that compare to intermittent fasting, calorie restriction, all the rest of this stuff? And I think that you're going to have nothing sauce there. Like I think it's going to be absolute bollocks from that point. And I think circling back around to your question on this stuff, I think that an optimization kind of occurs where if you want to be an amateur bodybuilder, you have to eat and train in a way that maybe starts getting antagonistic towards ultimate longevity, like a Dave Draper, pretty famous old school bodybuilder. He just died recently. I think he was in his late 70s, which isn't bad. But these bodybuilders that achieved really remarkable size and maintained a fair amount of that throughout their life, they don't have like stunningly impressive lifespans. Larry Scott, Dave Draper, some of these folks, like they live a pretty darn good life. And the interesting thing is they have a good health span. They tend to be
Right.
very, very healthy, very, very healthy, then die. But they
That's
don't
key.
have like which
Yeah.
is pretty important. So they don't have much loss in their health span, but they don't have a particularly impressive like total longevity. They're not getting into their
Right.
90s, they're not getting to 100 and stuff like that. But I do think that there's kind of a trade-off there. But I think that somebody that eats 2 meals a day, 2 meals and a snack, or maybe something crazy, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and they get to where they've got a double body weight back squat, a body weight and a half, or a double body weight deadlift, body weight and a half back squat, body weight and a quarter bench press, and then all the other stuff kind of somewhat in synergy there. You're going to have an impressive physique. Like the person will carry decent muscle. And I think that the strength and power and mobility of something like that could be easily maintained for a very long time. And it will take a couple of years for somebody to get to that spot. But then that's very maintainable. And it's like, unless you're doing power athletics like rugby or American football or shot put or something, you don't need more than that. If you want more than that, that's great, but you don't really need more strength or power than that. I do old guy jujitsu, and like I never, ever, ever lose due to a strength deficit. And that's even rolling against people that are 60, 70, 80 pounds heavier than me. There are plenty of people that are much stronger than I am, but I don't lose because of a lack of strength. I lose due to a lack of technique or maybe a gas or something like that. But the strength that I have is plenty for doing the things that I do. And I think I'll be able to maintain the bulk of what I've got for a very long time. I'll turn 50 in January. And I think I could probably have about the levels that I've got now when I'm 70, so that's not a bad trade-off. Whereas I think if I'm 5'9", about 170 pounds. If I was trying to be 190, 195 pounds, I think I would need to do things that might start getting antagonistic towards that ultimate, kind of longevity piece. Although it might be somewhat synergistic with health span, similar to like a
Mhm.
Dave Draper or something like that.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of that Derek More Plates, More Dates, and he brings up a lot of good points. And one of the points that he brings up with people who are bodybuilders is that what nobody thinks about is just you're just a large human, and you have to imagine every night when you go to sleep, going back to more of an ancestral standpoint, our ancestors didn't have that much muscle mass. And when they laid down to go to sleep, their neck wasn't enormous, so it didn't
Right.
collapse their airway. And it sounds so like simple, but it's true. when you're overweight or you're just insanely muscular, you're just a bigger person. And to maintain that lean mass, you have to continually shovel down calories.
Hmm.
It's not going to always be perfect for longevity. Another piece that you touched on once, and I love the way that you put this, is that some keto and carnivore people, due to mTOR, which is the mammalian target of rapamycin, because that term gets thrown out there a lot, and I don't think people always pick up on what it is. It's They get terrified of protein, even though someone like Dr. Gabrielle Line, who I think is like the best person who talks about protein, because she talks about the satiety effect. She talks about how important it is to maintain muscle into an older age. These carnivores are starting to look like vegans, or keto people are starting to look like vegans because
Keto,
they're
yeah,
right. They're
yeah.
terrified of protein because they think, oh well, it's going to spike my insulin, and then I'm going to stop burning fat. But it's like, okay, well, what's going to drive your ability to maintain muscle or grow if that's your goal? If you're so scared of protein, like there's trade-offs, and I'm sure that okay, maybe you could find studies that would say lower protein diets may produce a little bit more longevity. I don't know, but to me, I'd rather look better, perform better, and not have to worry about sarcopenia to the same degree if you could just eat a little bit more protein.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really the trade-off that I think folks miss in that is the supposition here is that decreasing protein will modulate the frequency of mTOR activation, and that this is going to decrease our likelihood of cancer primarily, but also like some thrombic diseases and stuff like that. Again, what they're comparing that against, though, is an chronically overfed state versus like a protein deficient state. How about a protein adequate state with exercise and metabolic health? Like they're not fucking doing it. They're not
no,
doing
no
that.
one wants to go the middle of the road.
Well, let's kind of find somewhat optimized health and then compare, higher and lower protein there. And it's a maybe these folks are right. Maybe they're right in that it's going to modulate your chance of cancer, but by how much? Like we really don't know. All of our risk profile for cancer or type 2 diabetes, all these things, it's a number probably less than one, whereas all of us with the topic of sarcopenia, it's a 1. We have a 100% risk of sarcopenia as we age. We'll lose muscle. We'll lose the type 2B motor units that produce the power that is so important for like glucose disposal and all that type of stuff. That's a guarantee. And the way that we hedge against that, this is one of the things that's really interesting to me on the longevity research. On the front end of this, everybody's worried about mTOR and overfeeding. And I think overfeeding is a legitimate problem. Being overfed is a problem. But when we really look at aging populations that age well, they eat a lot of protein. The people who eat more protein age better. So it's like, so during our middle years, we're just supposed to protein starve ourselves and then lose all the muscle mass. And then at the point of our life cycle, when it's the most difficult proposition to gain muscle, now we start it just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
It's like, find something that you enjoy doing, and hopefully that means some time in the gym. But even if you don't like being in the gym, like a full body, press, pull, hinge, squat, circuit training thing twice a week, you could get in and out of that in 20 minutes a shot. And it could all be selectorized machines. And God, that's going to give you so much benefit. And then eat 2 meals and a snack, and make sure it's protein centric. And I think that your body composition, your satiety, your metabolic health, and then this whole other thing. What if you fall down a hill? What if you fall off a ladder? What if you get injured? You're harder to kill if you're stronger. Like your
Absolutely. Yeah.
internal organs are protected, your bones are protected. But if your muscles are stronger, your bones are stronger. It's all these other, accidents are a major problem for shortening life. Once you hit 50 and beyond, don't get on a fucking ladder around your house. Like hire some young idiot to do
Yeah.
all that stuff. You would not believe the statistics on like middle-aged and older dudes falling off of ladders while trying to clean out like their rain gutters and stupid stuff like that. So the injury prevention and ability to withstand a traumatic event is just such an important factor when we're trying to divvy out risk assessment and risk mitigation in this story.
Right, right. And I think that's a big nuance that a lot of people miss. And it is sad. And I've seen old people all the time that, just, it's like, God, what could we have done to make the point to them? Like, hey, maybe you should do something to make you a little bit more mobile, or like you said, harder to kill. Um, just something to make you a little bit more healthier, because it's terrible to see some of these people who just don't look like they carry their own weight. They're brittle, they're
Yep.
fragile. Like, that's just, it's not good at all. Um, so you were talking about risk a little bit there as well. What are your thoughts around saturated fat and sugar? Because I had Ted Naiman on, and him and I had a little bit of a back and forth about this, and I'm very interested in it because to me, it seems like sugar's only bad because it provides you no satiation, and that's just extra calories you don't need. So it's easy to overconsume it, and therefore, the problems that come with obesity, because you're just not getting satisfied by those calories. The saturated fat conversation, I just, there's so much data out there. Like, okay, people want to tell you, you look at saturated fat, and your LDL cholesterol is going to skyrocket to 600, and you're going to die of a heart attack. You got some other low carb people that tell you saturated fat doesn't matter. And some people kind of say, well, saturated fat is the same kind of deal as sugar, where it's, empty calories that provide no satiation. But the way that I kind of look at saturated fat is that, okay, well, most foods with saturated fats, like if you're looking at whole foods like a ribeye steak or a lot of red meat, pork, going for the better stuff, I see that as a net positive, because you're getting, a lot of the nutrients that are in animal foods and only found in animal foods. They provide the satiation from the protein, so you're not going to eat as much. And then, the protein's going to help you to grow and maintain or build muscle. So I feel like when people demonize saturated fat and they go out of their way to demonize red meat, I feel like it's a harm, just because people don't understand that, like, you got to look at the big picture. And I feel like if you just say the saturated fat's bad and avoid saturated fat at all costs, you're doing more harm than good. Now, I know
Mhm.
I threw a lot at you, but I guess let's start with the sugar. What's your opinion on the big picture with sugar first?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're going to end up being like in almost like goose stepping synchrony on all of this,
Oh,
based
nice,
off of what
cool.
you were talking about. When we look at metabolic ward studies of sugar consumption, where people are basically locked in a hospital room just a step above prison, like and we know exactly what they're eating. Their pee is collected, their poo is collected. Like we know the ins, the outs. In that circumstance, then yeah, sugar is not that big of a nutrient of concern, because people are not being allowed to overeat, like if they're fed an isocaloric thing. And the more evidence-based nutrition folks will trot this out and say sugar is not a big deal, just weigh and measure your food. And it's like, well, okay, go to any Walmart at 11 o'clock at night and look around and see how well that is working as kind of a public
Mm.
health message.
Especially after a few element tequilas, right?
Fuck yeah, especially, so that's great in a metabolic ward setting. It's
Mhm.
wonderful for the people who are neurotic enough to have the discipline to do a physique competitor's diet and lifestyle. That will work. It's very difficult to work for virtually everybody else, and I cringe at even saying that, but it's the liquid sugar is maybe one of the things that I would push back on the most. It is
Okay.
so quick acting, it is so fast to overwhelm our satiety centers, and it does legitimately, it hits the liver so quickly that you begin converting glucose into fructose in the liver, which leads into non-alcoholic fatty liver. So that might be the one
Okay.
spot that I would push back and be like, actually, liquid sugar is going to get you into some dangerous ground, even on an isocaloric consumption. If you were to
Okay.
spoon it down, it might affect differently than if you drink it down. And this is some of
Sure.
Dr. Lustig's work, and it's pretty robust. Like they're
Hmm.
animal models, but it's been extrapolated to humans, and like they're able to look at the liver physiology. And I think something very bad, rate limiting steps are really important. So if I have a log and I set it on fire, that will be a nice source of heat over a period of time. if I pulverize that in a sawmill and turn it into a super fine powder, and I spin it in a room and get it aerosolized and then a spark, that will explode. I can have all of that thing burn instantly as if
Yeah.
it was, an air fuel gas mixture, and it'll explode. So the rates of these things become pretty important too. And when we drink calories, whether it's buttered coffee or sugar, I think that we end up with some problems. So yeah, I think we agree pretty much on the sugar, and one of the
Okay.
main dietary interventions. I'm like, just don't do liquid calories, don't do juice. If you have a cocktail, do use Diet Coke instead of regular Coke. Like, there's just some really simple things that can be done to fix that stuff. On the saturated fat front, I think it is still kind of complex. Like, what type of fat are we talking about? Butter, interestingly, seems to raise lipoproteins in a lot of people. Lipoproteins are the molecules that carry cholesterol through the
Hmm.
body, and it seems to raise the LDL lipoproteins and cholesterol disproportionately to others. But not everybody does this. Not everybody who does the buttered coffee or eats tons of butter sees a lipoprotein increase. So that's kind of a weird thing. Some things like palm oil don't seem to raise lipoproteins at all in anybody. Stearic acid, which is a main saturated fat in both beef and chocolate, doesn't seem to raise cholesterol levels in much of anybody. But then palmitate by itself, which is another, it's one of the main constituents in palm oil. But if you eat palmitate separately from other foods, it does seem to raise lipoproteins in some people. So that's a really interesting mix. And then there's this question. There are folks that are very much on the cholesterol or lipoproteins and cholesterol as the primary driver of cardiovascular disease. Other people have kind of in this vascular endothelial damage model that if the endothelium gets damaged, so like we only accumulate atherosclerotic plaques in the arteries of our circulatory system. We never accumulate it in the veins. So there's something about blood pressure and the non-laminar flow and whatnot that occurs in there that seems to be a factor. But these are kind of two worlds. But I think one thing is worth saying, like a person who has quote high cholesterol, who is diabetic and disordered blood glucose levels and high inflammation and all these other things, they have a probably significantly higher risk profile than somebody who is eating a ketogenic diet, who has low inflammation, low blood sugar levels, with the same cholesterol and lipoprotein. Now, the thing that gets tricky is that there are folks in the low carb world that will say they have zero cardiovascular disease risk because their insulin level is low. I wish that were true. I hope that's true, but I don't think it's going to end up being true. I still think that some of those people would do well from either the shuffling of some of the saturated fat into monounsaturated fat, so more like olives and nuts and olive oil and stuff like that. Maybe the reintroduction of 50 to 75 grams of carbohydrate a day. Like we've seen cholesterol levels get cut in half in people who start eating 50 to 75 grams of carbs from good sources and then just shift their fat sources around a little bit. 15 years ago, I thought I had all this stuff completely figured out. And every single day that goes on, I feel like I understand lipidology less and less. Like I think it just becomes very granular and very specific to the individual. And we have some kind of broad brushstroke stories. Like, again, somebody who is generally metabolically healthy is going to be better under virtually any circumstance relative to
Right.
somebody who's not generally metabolically healthy. But then from there, like I think it's hard to say, well, because you eat low carb, your cardiovascular risk profile is zero. If you have high cholesterol levels and whatnot.
Right. Now I've heard people talk about I think it's the Mendelian
Mm-hmm.
randomizations. I can't recall what exactly that is, but the argument I've heard about the LDL levels is that they say when you take the Mendelian randomization factor or whatever the heck it is, I think it has something to do with like twins or people from the
Mm-hmm.
same family.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of similar genetics, and they find that the people who have higher LDL tend to have higher heart attacks so I was originally on the train of, oh, well, cholesterol doesn't really matter. And then as I began to hear more and more of that, I was like, okay, well, maybe that does play a factor. But, it still seems like the lipidology stuff, every time I've tried to approach it, like kind of like you said, it's like there is so much to this. There's so many different levers. And, what about this? What about that? Like, there's so many factors that go into
Yep.
it. To just kind of myopically blame it on LDL just seems too, like, it's not conclusive enough. But once again, I don't know anything about that stuff.
Yeah, a good friend of mine, Dr. Bill Cromwell, is a lipidologist, and he'd be a great guy for the show. Like he's just a good interview and
Sure.
solid dude. And one of the things that has changed my mind on this, and I forget the exact studies. He always has the studies right off the top of his head, but they have sliced people into different groups where you've got elevated lipoproteins, insulin resistant, elevated lipoproteins, insulin sensitive. And although, again, the risk profile is lesser in the insulin sensitive group, it is not non zero. It is non zero, and so you are still experiencing a risk profile there. Now, again, people will say, well, there's some other like vascular endothelial damage that's occurring, whether it's high blood pressure, it's this or that. I don't know. Like my lipoproteins have tended to run a little on the higher side. I can tweak that by eating a little bit more carbs and shifting around to more monounsaturated fats, and then they look great. So, but I would like it to look different because I would love to eat, sticks of butter in my coffee because it's convenient and it tastes good and all that type of stuff. But
Yeah.
Bill paints a pretty compelling picture around the notion that he delineates the nuance, but he doesn't give the real low carb jihadis what they want, which is this out that so long as you never eat
Yeah.
something above an asparagus, that you're never going to have a heart attack or a stroke because you're never going to experience cardiovascular disease. And he is not in that camp, and he will administer some very low dose statins. But here's an interesting thing: a normal dose of Crestor is 25 to 30 milligrams per day, and that's considered a low end dose for a statin. Bill will have people do 5 milligrams of Crestor Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And because they're eating, these are in low carb people who have low inflammation, good glycemic control, and he just gives them a lick of a statin and their lipoproteins drop by 30 or 40%.
Oh,
Like it
wow.
drops more than what you think it would do. It drops more with a dose that isn't even supposed to be therapeutic.
Right.
So this isn't some guy that's just like, oh, he loves paleo, he loves keto, he loves all that stuff. His daughter had really severe ulcerative colitis, which she ended up fixing with my book, and so like he loves me, like he really likes me. Uh, but he's the dude. So he's a PhD in physical chemistry. Basically, he's a physicist who studied chemistry, who then went to medical school and got into lipidology.
Yeah, it's
But he's
kind of
just,
funny. It seems like a lot of like engineers and people like that. I had
yes,
Brian Sanders from Food Lies on. Ted Naiman was a
yeah,
engineer. All
yep,
these guys come from different fields and they go to nutrition. And I was listening to a different interview with you, but you brought up the point that like a lot of people from different fields, they don't necessarily have a dog in this nutrition fight
right.
initially. So I get annoyed when I see people say, "Oh, stay in your lane." Like, dude, I fix cars, right? But you see the guitars behind me.
Right.
I could deadlift 500 pounds. Like, clearly, I'm doing something right. So, are there more knowledgeable people than me? Yes. But that doesn't mean that my opinion means nothing, and that all the research that I've done on the topics, speaking to people like you, Philip Avadia, who's a cardiothoracic surgeon, I get educated on these things because I care and it's interesting. So, sometimes people who don't necessarily have a dog in this fight can bring some outside perspective because they don't have that myopic view or that bias kind of already built in.
Just about this maybe jumps the shark a little bit, or maybe it's self-serving, but in my experience, the stay in your lane crowd is just about universally statists. Like they are about the state. They're all about polishing the knob of
Yeah.
credentialing and all this stuff. And I mean,
Appealing to authority. Yeah.
yeah, the appeal to authority, and there's an interesting mix within that. so I had LASIK surgery a number of years ago, it was 15 years ago. And I want a qualified surgeon who's board certified, all this stuff. And then what I wanted was to read all the reviews from all the thousands of people that he's worked with, because this is a market-based, things like Yelp were painful for it. They're both good and bad. Like if the customer was a dick and they just didn't like the proprietors of a restaurant, then they could burn the thing down. It kind of sucked, but they were good. Yeah. In that you could have these really honest reviews of somebody like an eye surgeon, and so I found this guy that had done a zillion of these surgeries, and the results were just uniformly fantastic, and he had awesome bedside manner, and so I went with this guy. So this is a combination of both some, I wouldn't even call it, it's more, it's trade credentialing. It's like becoming a blacksmith and interning as a blacksmith. Like the way we do medicine could be done like the Middle Ages trades, really, when you get right down to it. Like kids at 13 could enter into medical professions and engineering. Like the way we do this stuff is absolutely ridiculously inefficient. And then you get phenomenal training and vetting. If you want to learn how to make bridges, then there's certain, you use triangles and rebar. You don't use balsa wood and other weird shapes and stuff like that. But then you get a market feedback on it. It's like, okay, well, they built these bridges and they fucking fell. Okay, well, don't go with those guys. Or this eye surgeon, you got all these reviews. They're 5-star reviews. There's virtually no negative reviews. Then then we get this interplay between credentialing and that shows competence, hopefully. But this is an entirely different story versus I have access to the same information that everybody else in the world has access to. I'm not trying to demonstrate that I can conduct eye surgery. I'm not trying to convince you that I can build a bridge over the Tacoma Narrow Straits. I'm just simply having a discussion around lipoproteins. And I used to be an electrical engineer by trade, but I've gotten in and started studying this. This is where these statist assholes, like they're stymieing innovation. And like, these are
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I could go on and on about that, but I look so askance and down my nose at like the whole credentialing thing and all that stuff. Like there were ways to get to that desired outcome that are very, very different than what these people are latched onto. What these people are latched onto is an anachronistic process. And we could have way better, way faster, way cheaper if we had kind of like trade school applied to so many of these professions, and then a market-based evaluation of the performance. And transparency, stick some blockchain in there so that you can't fuck around with what the results are. And you've got a really amazing situation there.
I think my entire listenership ears perked up as soon as you started kind of going down that whole rabbit hole. That's what I'm all about, though, is, essentially if you have a free market in most things, these people are going to be insured, right? Because they don't want to screw over their customers, because you want people to come back, right? You're not going to build a faulty bridge, because if people die, then guess what? Nobody's going to want a bridge to be built by you. If you make a shitty cake, nobody's going to eat your cake. You're going to go out of business. Like, the market has a way of regulating these things, and nobody ever thinks about that. But that goes back to the point of just saying, oh, well, stay in your lane. Well, what if that person you just told stay in the lane, this sounds so outlandish, but had the cure to cancer in their mind? Like, they were thinking about it, they're on the right path, and you just told that person to stay in their lane. And just because, they're a grease monkey like me who fixes cars for a living, they could do so many great things. But people who do shit like that, it's like, you have no idea what that person could do.
So one of the smartest people I've ever met with biochemistry and metabolism, he's never, to my knowledge, I don't think he's ever done a day of formal education on those topics. He is a successful HVAC business owner, and he just got, because his son had type 1 diabetes, he got in and learned everything he could about this. And the guy's like a 190 IQ who went into business and has a successful business, and he has a near photographic memory. And I feel like I'm pretty good at this stuff. This guy, Mike Julian, he could tie me in knots with the details of biochemistry and metabolism. and he has no credentials in it. And he's far, far better at it than I am. And this is the stuff that just chaps my ass, because when you look at the non-linearity of outstanding performers like a Michael Jordan to the rest of basketball, it's kind of like, did anybody else even really show up, when people are at kind of their apex? And so you have people that maybe aren't formally trained, but again, we live in a time where even with YouTube and stuff like that, people figure out how to lay tile and do even a lot of the trades. Now, I think that there's a huge benefit to having somebody looking over your shoulder doing a lot of this
Right.
stuff, because you'll fuck up a lot and they can save you from it. But if you just have access to good information and you can tinker and iterate and experiment, and then you can demonstrate, show your homework, we're good. We're pretty good on that. And to dismiss somebody, be like, for somebody, I've seen a couple of people ask Mike, they're like, well, what's your background? Because he'll be talking with a PhD or a doctor about this stuff. And he's like, oh, I have an HVAC company. And they're like, well, you know, beat it,
Mhm.
piss boy, and it's like,
Yeah.
this guy could teach you this stuff. I wouldn't want Mike removing my appendix if push came to shove. I would want a
Right.
physician who has gone through that process. But
Mhm.
talking metabolism and integrated fuel metabolism and stuff like that, like, you're going to be hard pressed to find very many people better at it than this guy.
Yeah, and like I said, it's sad because I've seen a lot of people in the nutrition space get upset when outsiders come in, or people in the nutrition space kind of go outwards and they say, "Oh, well, stay in your lane. This isn't your thing. I have a PhD in this, so I know what I'm talking about." Well, just because you have a PhD and just because you spent time specializing in this doesn't, not everybody's experience is the same. And it sounds so cliche, but it's true because, some people are able to pick up a guitar right behind me, right? Someone could pick that up and be damn near a virtuoso in a couple months. I'm not the best guitar player in the world, but I've been playing for about 15, 16, 17 years, somewhere around there. I don't even know how long at this point, but I've been playing for a long time, so I got good at it, right? So when you tell somebody who could pick up that talent, stay in their lane, like I said, I just don't like this idea of discouraging people unnecessarily. Now, like you said, obviously you're not going to hire a mechanic to go lob your arm off and sew it back on, but this person may know a thing or two that may steer you in the right direction. So, kind of getting onto this, that we're talking about people who become experts in certain subjects. Or do you still have a little bit of time?
Yeah. Yep.
All right, cool,
Yep.
cool. I just want to make sure I don't want to keep you too long. You've been very generous with your time, and I really appreciate it. Everybody in the world has an opinion on COVID, and I really like your take on it. And I never really heard you talk kind of, I don't want to say libertarianism, but with a concern necessarily for freedom until this last year. But I feel like at this point, we've all been kind of thrust into it because how big our government is. And even like sometimes I've heard you talk about the housing crash, and your economics seem to be on point. Now, as a libertarian, I'm a big fan of the Austrian school of economics. The way you were talking about some things, it kind of sounded like you had little inklings of that as well. Um, these last 2 years have changed the world, definitely the United States at least, for, I don't want to say strictly the worst, but kind of the worst. Um, what have the last 2 years essentially been like for you? And, what are some of your thoughts? And we can kind of go down this rabbit hole. So, kind of curious on your thoughts. And like I said, we'll take it from there.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you asking. So it's interesting for me personally. COVID's been great. I've had multiple. I had early stage investments that were acquired because they saw ridiculous growth during COVID. I just got lucky that I was in different spaces that were amenable to growth due to online purchasing, and I had a couple of different investments that have already been acquired. My businesses personally have benefited enormously. Like, I have an online health platform called the Healthy Rebellion, which, between the toxicity of social media and just the general, the way the wind is blowing with everything, people need a place that they can go and just vent, like do much like what we're doing here. Just like, hey, does this sound crazy? And then have
Mhm.
some people say, yeah, man, I think that that's a little much. And other people say, well, I don't know if you're really even crazy enough, and have a fucking discussion about it.
Yeah.
I homeschool. I lived in Texas and Montana. And so both the states have been open. I've been doing jujitsu. I had COVID myself in November of last year, and I had 2 days that really sucked. Coffee still doesn't taste the same for me, so that is my long COVID story. But I'm metabolically healthy. And we're pretty sure I caught COVID from my dog, which is a topic for an entirely different day. But uh, personally, it's been great. I should be super excited about COVID mandates and everything about it, because even everything still that I have going on would benefit more from more stringent COVID stuff than not. And I'm also completely horrified by where this stuff has gone. It When 9/11 happened and we started going into Iraq, I had some really big concerns. When we started rolling out the Patriot Act, I was apoplectic over it, because I'm like, this is the end of the Fourth Amendment as we know it. And a bunch of people told me to shut up, that I was a left-wing pinko, I'm un-American, and all the rest of it. And I was right about that. Like, it was absolute hogwash. And we set into play an encroachment into our personal liberties by the state that is never going to get walked back, and has been prepared to be weaponized in this situation too. Like
Absolutely.
the
Yeah.
people speaking out at school board meetings and being called domestic terrorists,
Mhm.
and the threat of the Patriot Act being waved over them to shut them up. So I mean, in broad brush, I think it's an absolute disaster. And if this stuff had been by, so they say never attribute to malice what can be explained via incompetence. Incompetence would have at least, here's a win, here's a loss, here's a win, here's a
It would
loss.
have ended up a wash.
It would have kind of been a wash. It's like, oh, they accidentally did some stuff right and they accidentally did some stuff wrong. That has not been the case here. There has been a uniform push in a very specific direction that seems to be vaccines, vaccine mandates, and most important to the mandate, like some sort of a digital tracking of all people that feeds into a social
Mhm.
credit score and all the rest of that. And I just can't for the life of me figure out anything else other than that as the end game. Because early on, I want to say that it was at the end of March 2020, I guess, just as things are kind of ramping
Right.
up. But when they said our plan is you're going to hunker in place, wear masks, and we're going to get a vaccine. And this vaccine is in a class of viruses that we've never had a successful vaccine before. Like, they tried to do vaccines for the SARS-CoV-1 virus, and it was unsuccessful. It killed the animals that they did it in. Antibody-dependent enhancement ended up being this huge problem there. So our only solution is vaccines. We're not looking at any off-label drugs. And at that point, it was early, like hydroxychloroquine was kind of kicked around a little bit. I don't think ivermectin was quite on the radar. Fluvoxamine was definitely not on the radar. But there was no centralized push for, we're going to scan our database, our pharmacopoeia of existing pharmaceuticals and see which of these may be important in prevention and treatment of this disease. There was nothing. That was super suspicious to me. The fact that we were only going to do a vaccine in a class of viruses that has never been done was super suspicious. This was sold to us as an existential threat. Like,
Mhm.
this is a threat to civilization as we understand it. There haven't been a ton of examples of situations like this, but like the Manhattan Project is one that really popped into my head. The nearing the end of World War II, but the Germans are racing towards the development of an atomic bomb. The United States is doing everything they can to develop an atomic bomb. Whoever develops an atomic bomb first wins. Like, it's a done deal. And Philip K.
Yeah.
Dick has a great alternate history, The Man in the High Castle, that looks at what happens to the world if the actual Nazis get the atomic bomb first. And what they did within the Manhattan Project is they had all these brilliant physicists and engineers work together but they were in different teams working on oftentimes competing ideas. There was one group that was going down an enriched uranium track. There was another one that was looking at a plutonium track. There were considerations around the way that you blast this stuff together, and the shape charge that would ram it together so that you could get a fission reaction and everything. Nobody knew if it was even possible to make an atomic bomb. Nobody knew if like uranium would work or plutonium would work. So we diversified our risk exposure by having multiple prongs going in different directions. That's what you do when you face an existential threat. That's actually what you do if you do basic fucking retirement planning. You don't put everything in the stock
Yeah.
market. You put a little bit here and a little bit there. There was no diversification of risk in this thing at all. So the
Right.
wealthiest, smartest country on the planet isn't going to diversify its risk exposure when tackling this existential threat. And that was like the point for me. It was maybe March 23rd of last year that I'm like, this is bullshit. And then it wasn't too long after that that we started getting credible information out of China, which it's hard to say credible information and China at the same time, but it was crystal clear that the morbidity and mortality around COVID was extremely high with metabolically sick individuals. People with multiple comorbidities, mortalities were the people that were getting sick and dying. And there was not a single public health message, take vitamin D, get in the sun, lose weight, and XYZ. And so that was the further thing when public health messaging did not focus on agency of the individual to improve their life and improve their health to improve something, then I knew that there was bullshit afoot. And I mean, it kind of goes on and on, but those are the big pieces, a singular focus on a vaccine, not diversifying our approach to dealing with it. That's not an existential threat. That seems like an opportunity to me that's being exploited at that point.
Right, and it definitely was. I've kind of looked at COVID as not the big killer, but it was more of a pin. So Trump, when he was running as a candidate, was spot on. He sounded like a Austrian economist because he would say the stock market's a bubble held up by low interest rates, right? So everybody can afford to, buy back stocks super cheap. They can borrow money, same as cash essentially, and then inflate their assets. So that's the only reason why they're able to keep their stock up as high as it is, right? Well, then we also had a public health bubble because everybody's obese, everybody's eating hyperpalatable foods that they can't put the fork down, so they get obese. Nobody wants to exercise. Student loans, people are buying houses they can't afford. The only reason why they can afford is because of low interest rates. And then COVID comes along, right? And that became the pin that popped the everything bubble. It took everything down to its knees. Where if we were a prosperous economy that had trade surpluses, we had a populace that was productive enough to have savings, or you had higher interest rates where people were encouraged to save, then this would have been like a flip in the road, right? Our country, let's say 70 years ago, right? Where you look at pictures, nobody's obese. Everybody had savings. They could afford a rainy day. Things like that, we'd have been able to weather the storm no problem. You look at some of the Middle Eastern countries, and they fared relatively well with it. But what do they have? They have savings. They have tight knit family structures. They have good metabolic health. And we were looking over here like, oh, I wonder why they're doing so well. We're all dying left and right. And not that they didn't see any morbidity or mortality from it, but they did. It's like, just look at their example. They have a pretty well structured society. Now, granted, their government's completely fucked up, but they got the family part right. They got the health part right. And funny enough, they eat a lot of meat over there. And once again, just tight knit families. Here, it's just not the same culture anymore. We're not the America that we once were. So when COVID came along, it was just, like I said, perfect thing to just take us out at the knees and really show how weak how weak just America is in general. And it saddens me to say that because we have the potential, we have the people, we have the technology to be the greatest nation in the world, but for politically expedient reasons, to virtue signal about climate change, to keep interest rates low so that way you can borrow money cheap and buy back stock, and so you can fund wars and sell weapons from Lockheed Martin and General Arms, whoever. That's the reason why we can't have the U.S. that we once had. So it's just sad that we're not where we once were, and this should have been a blip under the radar because most people do just kind of get it, get over it. But because we're such an unhealthy nation that's so levered to the max with debt, um, this really took everyone back, and it really kind of kicked everybody's ass. More so the damage to the economy than even the sickness, as sad as that is to say.
Yeah, it's funny. I've long said that virtually all of our problems could be traced back to going off the gold standard and, entering the
Oh
world
my
of
God.
fiat economy. And it's
Yes.
funny. I was on John Stossel's show a number of years ago, and I made this case around like the junk food industry basically was born out of that. And he's like, I don't agree with that. And like he and I have kept in contact a little bit over the years, but there was just an article. It was a research piece that actually made the case that uh, fiat economy has made processed foods cheaper and real foods more expensive. And it kind of details how this stuff has happened. And I pinged it to him. I'm like, see, I was right about this, but yeah, I mean, that's been this big undoing. And if I put on a little bit of my tinfoil hat, and you look at Europe, the United States, even Japan, and these debt-driven fiat economies, there will be a chicken's coming home to roost at some point with that. The question
Hmm.
is it 3 minutes, 3 years, 30 years? Like we don't know. It's lasted far longer than
Right.
what I've thought before the whole thing kind of implodes and melts down. But a really credible case to be made in all that stuff is if you got a big swath of the population on a universal basic income and everybody on some sort of nationalized health care, if you collected as many of the guns and weapons as you could, then when all of this stuff pops, oh, and if you've got your passport to your health and shopping and food and medicine, and if your social credit score,
Music
you know,
venues, yeah.
it sucks, which yours and mine would be a zero, then you've got phenomenal control over people when all this stuff kind of goes sideways. And
Hmm.
if and when it does go sideways, it's like, hey, we're going to erase your debt, but you need to do this, that, and the other to be in good stead with all this stuff. And that sounds really crazy, but when you try to figure out what hypothesis really fits, like why would you be pushing so hard? Like what is the end game that is desired
Right.
to bring us? Like I've seen some really interesting people. Vinay Prasad, who's a brilliant physician, historically very very left leaning. Like he works in the Silicon Valley medical system of the Bay Area. He wrote a piece that was basically like the way that we're handling COVID is bringing us really close to civil war.
Hmm.
And he was no joke about it, and basically talking about how we've created a situation where an individual, whether left leaning or right leaning, democratically elected president, we have another spicy flu season or something happens, that person, now we have the template for locking society down, stripping people of their rights, and enacting a really powerful totalitarian endgame within all that. And that makes a lot of sense to me. It sounds
Yeah.
kind of crazy, and I mean, lots of conspiracy crazy theories can make sense but be entirely wrong. But when I go all the way from the economics to the social political stuff to
Hmm.
also like that scenario allows, via seniorage, like the people, if you're printing money like crazy, the people who are at the front of the line with that, they do
Yeah.
pretty well.
Absolutely.
It's all the rest of us schmucks that it really starts to suck. um that makes a lot of sense. It's also terrifying because it paints a picture of a pretty shitty future, or at least a very tumultuous future, that we will have to navigate one way or the other. But nothing else about this really makes sense except in that kind of big end game deal. And I don't know that like this thing was like engineered. It almost certainly seems to be released from a lab. I don't believe that it was likely done intentionally, but it's also, I know for a fact that there's all kinds of think tanks with all kinds of binders, either printed or virtual, and it's like how to capitalize on a pandemic, how to turn lemons into lemonade when there's a
Yeah.
terrorist attack, and I mean, smart people get paid lots of money to sit down and war game stuff like this. And it's like, well, if this thing were to happen, how could we capitalize on this? And that work has been done.
Yeah, there probably is a library that we'll never see of people just kind of picking away. It says when shit hits the fan, when shit's going good, how to make people compliant. There's definitely something to that. But, it really does kind of amount to a two-tiered caste system essentially with what they're pushing. And it's abhorrent because from my understanding, which could always be better, is that these vaccines are just very, very mildly effective. Not to say that they're not effective at all. And this goes to the nuance. I know we were talking a little bit off the camera about this, but it seems like some people, they can legitimately benefit from the vaccine. So there's some people immunocompromised, elderly, obese, like, hey, it should still be your choice no matter what, but probably should
But
get the
probably the
shot.
risk profile is favorable for the vaccine.
Exactly. Right.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
my fiance and I had it last year, or no, I'm sorry, back in March, and I literally felt like just a little under the weather for 3 days, and then woke up on the following Monday. I had no taste or smell. I drink dark roast coffee, so I took a sip of it, and I'm like, something's not right here, and I felt perfectly normal. Took a shower and I made some that butcher box pork belly bacon. If you ever had
Hmm.
that, oh my god, it's fantastic. But it has like that pepper taste to it. Took a bite of it. I'm like, I can't fucking taste this. What the fuck? So I ate my whole breakfast, which was I think a New York strip, eggs and bacon. Like I didn't fucking taste a thing. So
It might have been cardboard. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 So I go upstairs and my fiance's getting up. I sit down on the bed and I said, I think I got COVID. Like I was surprised that I had it. Um, but my point in all that is it was so mild for me, and we got our antibodies checked about 2 or 3 months later, and we both want to do it again because it's literally a $10 test. Um, we had natural immunity, and from what I understand, our antibody levels were higher than people who were vaccinated. So, what is the purpose of us getting a vaccine now at this point? Because I'm 27, right? At the time, I was 26. My fiance was 24. Why should we get vaccinated if we have natural immunity? So now we're immune. We can't spread it. There's a paper that came out from the University of East Anglia, I think it was, out of Japan, that contact traced 10 million people, and they found less than, I think it was 120 people had spread COVID asymptomatically. So you don't spread it asymptomatically. Even the World Health Organization had came out and said that this doesn't spread asymptomatically. We did lockdowns, right? Locked people in their homes to prevent the asymptomatic spread of COVID. And then they come out 6 months later and say, well, that doesn't happen. Um, why should we get an experimental vaccine? And look, I'm not anti-vax at all. If you want to get it, go get it. There's just zero case in my mind for me or my fiance to go get it because we both have it. We have natural immunity. We got over it. We're fine. And if you're going to tell me kids have to get it, like kids don't spread it. They don't really get severe cases of COVID. I think in all the data I've seen from the CDC, I don't even think it's 100 kids of the whole world died of COVID. And their risk profile is probably so that they might see more damage from getting a vaccine versus getting COVID, which if you give them the vaccine, they got the vaccine. You can't change that. You
Right.
can't guarantee they're going to get COVID. So it's a long
Well,
tirade, but yeah.
no, and I mean that's a piece that I neglected to mention when my hound dog years started turning
You're good, yeah.
when they said a vaccine only, we have to reach herd immunity with a vaccine. I'm like, well, what about naturally acquired immunity? Now, granted, I'll give them that at that point we still didn't have great data on it, but there was absolutely no investigation into that. And there was no,
Mhm.
here's part of our multi-pronged plan. Like, even if they had wanted me to ultimately get the
Yeah.
vaccine, had they at least said, well, we're going to track people who have had the virus, and that's going to be heat maps so we can see where people have had it. And then we're going to target focus people who want the vaccine, and then in aggregate, we're going to get this. You start sounding scientific. You start sounding like you've got an actual game plan towards remediating this thing. But when you completely ignore the potential impact of naturally acquired immunity, and that this doesn't factor at all into herd immunity. And you're going to double down that it's like, no, you may have had it, but you need both shots. Oh, and now you need to be on the booster schedule too. And every single time that one experiences either a virus or a vaccine, there is a non-zero risk of complications. Except that with naturally acquired immunity, for most circumstances, unless we're talking about influenza, which has a super high mutation rate and it tends to change each year, and it's got these natural non-human hosts where you can get DNA recombination, you can get some really nasty variants that pop up, and everything is kind of a different circumstance. But there was no mosaic of options presented here. It was a one and done. And when I hear one and done stuff, it makes me think high carb, low fat. It makes me think modern monetary policy. It's just kind of like, save it, man. No, like this is a super complex world, and you don't solve things like that. It doesn't have to be super complex, but like you need a multi-pronged game plan at a minimum, or at least be willing to do data collection and analyze and look. Like if they had wanted me to get the vaccine, they could have at least gone through some song and dance to act like they're doing the real thing. And they're like, we still think it might be good for you, Rob, to do this. And I would have been like, okay, you've done your diligence. And all. I am libertarian leaning, but I'm not so libertarian that I don't understand that. Like, okay, I'm not fully into like the taxation of stuff thing. It's like, functional roadways are nice.
We'll get you there. We'll get you there.
Some stuff like that. You know, I do. Yeah, I'm a little more middle of ground, I guess, within that stuff. But yeah, so, but they didn't send anything like that. They didn't tickle my giblets in any way that would get me to be like, I'm going to trust you guys. It's like, no, this is like amateur. This is either amateur hour to a degree that is so. I'm not an immunologist. I'm not a physician, but I laid in my own head, laid out like so many better and more credible ways to tackle this. And then the immunologists and the doctors who pushed back against the way this has been handled said exactly the shit that I was saying. I'm like, okay, maybe, I guess I'm not so crazy here, but that's where, again, it's like, okay, this isn't incompetence. Like, this is outright malfeasance here. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's so disturbing to me that so many people kind of went along with it. But I've said this in multiple podcasts now, but I don't think there is a huge appetite for it at this point. And this is why I'm a huge optimist in 2022 and 2024. I really hope that there will be significant change. I'm strongly optimistic for it, and I don't think all of that's going to be correct. But, when you tell people, hey, if you get double vaccinated, you're protected, you're good, throw away your mask, you're good. And then you start seeing breakthrough cases, and then, you do a 180.
Pull your mask out of the garbage, you got to wear it again.
Yeah, right. Yeah. When you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, people don't trust you. I had Spike Cohen, the VP on the Libertarian Party presidential nomination, on my podcast, and he had told me about the reason why Israel and I think some other countries over in Europe have high vaccination rates, because they were honest. They said, hey, this isn't going to stop the spread. This isn't going to stop you from getting it, but it may stop the severity. Take it if you want it. If not, it's free. Just completely up to you. I think with that message, a lot of people are going to be like, okay, well, what do I have to lose? But when you tell people, like you said, one and done, hey, here, take this, you're good. And then especially when you walk it back and tell them, well, you're going to need a booster every 6 months, people are like, all right, well, jig's up here. And it's always funny because they did knock natural immunity. Well, we don't know how long the antibodies last. Okay, then what about vaccines and boosters? And I'm not against it, but just be honest. If you're honest, people will trust you. You build capital with people when they trust you. But if you treat them like retarded 6-year-olds, they're not going to listen. Eventually, they're going to tell you to go pound salt.
Well, and this is something that Vinay Prasad made a really good case for, again, which is that trust in public health is gone. I mean, there's maybe a chunk of there's a chunk of the country that if public health told them now to, there was a joke around like injecting chlorine or bleach or something like that. There was some joke meme or around that. I do feel like now, if Dr. Fauci said if you did microdosing of bleach, that would be good, and I think some people would do that, and they didn't vote for Trump, and there's going to be a real consistent play there. But so COVID was bad. It clearly was bad. And I mean, the way we handled it made things worse, like supply chains and all the rest of that stuff. But it made enough people sick and it caused enough problems that we had some kind of dodgy moments there where like some supply chains were unclear and different stuff like that. Like we've got all of the backlog of supply chains now.
Right.
And there's economic reasons like overly generous, government stimulus, but then they made people stay home. So they kind of had to do something. So it's just circular firing squad.
It's
But
self-licking ice cream cone.
yeah, if we get something like MERS, which they also funded gain of function research in MERS, MERS is a legitimate, like no fudging the numbers, no magic, fairy tales around statistics. It's a no joke 30% case fatality rate, an infection fatality rate. If you get it, you got a 3 out of 10 chance of dying. The 7 that live have a hell of a time living. Like it fucks them up. That is a civilization ender because you have enough doctors, enough engineers, enough police, enough fire, enough medical staff, stock people who stock shelves in supermarkets and stuff, sick and dying. That all of it grinds to a halt. It's done, and this is so. One, the same people who have run the pandemic response, who funded gain of function research in SARS-CoV-2, also appear to have done gain of function research in at least MERS and a couple of other, 30 to 60% infection mortality rate diseases. So we got that to see when that happens. And if that does happen, who's going to trust anybody now? Like, it might actually be the thing that I need to do superhuman and heroic efforts to save my life and my family. And I'm not really gonna trust those people straight out of the gate. I'm gonna have to start seeing bodies stacked up in the streets before I'm like, oh, I guess this is the real deal. This isn't another, dress rehearsal. This is the real thing. So I'm optimistic on the one hand, but I also I think we're so fucked. I think we're so fucked on so many levels. Like I am hopeful that something good will come later. But I think about my grandparents' generation where they lived through the Great Depression and World War II. That was a nearly 20-year period of heartache and terror and problems, and I wouldn't be the least bit surprised that we are in for that. And circling back to one of your original points, we are not the country that we were when our grandparents went through that shit.
Absolutely not.
We are super fragmented. We are at each other's throats at every conceivable level. We have regulatory capture of like every aspect of government. And my only real hope within that is some of the stuff like what I've seen in Florida, where, Florida is like, hey, we might spin up some of our own state level militia and stuff like that. And we're really going to start taking care of some things at a local level. In Utah, they have long had a plan for what they will do when the funding for, the federal funding that's supposed to keep schools open, they know that that's going to stop it someday. So what do they do when they do that? There are some places that are kind of planning ahead for when some of these larger institutional level inputs fail, but not many of them, and not the coastal states, not the places with massive population density, And so that's going to be tough sledding for those people, and it's has the potential to be really ugly. And I see so few people, and I don't know what I would put as a probability on that. Is it 5%? Is it 50%? I don't know. But when you talk about like a civilization ending existential threat, that is where you do want to pump the brakes. That's where you want to diversify your risk exposure and start doing whatever the fuck you can to walk this stuff back. And I don't see much of that.
Right, and nobody has an appetite for it at this point, even if it was a legitimate threat, because The capital you once had with the public is gone.
It's gone.
And this is why people love Trump so much, is because he was absolutely right when he criticized the media. And I'm not a Trump guy at all. If you look through my Twitter, if you look through my shows, anything, but he was really good and spot on about the media. Is that is a constant propaganda machine who just pumps out, BS after BS after BS, and people recognize that. So it's good, but then again, if we do get to this civilization ender where we do need, something to really rein something in, trust is gone. But one reason to be optimistic is, like you said, there are some people who are starting to plan ahead.
Yeah.
It is good that, I know Brian Sanders was talking about a decentralized food network, which is huge because supply chains are an issue, right? We gave everybody a bunch of free money, and what they do, they go on shopping sprees buying stuff from China, and now all of a sudden we have boats backed up all across the country, all over this country. Well, once again, when nobody produces stuff and you hand everybody free money, and you literally all you did is create inflation, and those people go on shopping sprees, well, yeah, are you surprised that now there's a bunch of goods coming from overseas that we didn't produce and that we now get to consume because we sent them debt? Shocker. So when these supply chains collapse, when or if I should say, to have a localized food network, that's important. To
Yep.
know your neighbor, that's important. To maybe have your wife and another few families that are good with maybe one of the people staying home to homeschool the kids together, that's great. Getting back to a sense of community, getting back to the local level or even just a state level where you're closer to home, that's huge. And I think that's going to have to be the way going forward, because the federal government, do you really trust anybody with your money who can steal trillions of dollars every single year, murder children with no responsibility, and run up $29 trillion in debt while doing that? Do you think these people are fit to govern your day-to-day life? I don't. I don't think you do. I don't think many people do. So going forward, we got to get back to the America that we once were, where we were a nation of, rugged individuals who aren't dependent on the government, and we're dependent on ourselves through robust health, through tight knit families, tight knit communities, and maybe even churches. I'm not a religious person, but if that brings the communities back together, then I'm all for it. I think that's the only way out of this.
Yeah, I agree. And the kind of cool thing about that is, what does it do for our quality of life today? It improves it.
Right. Yeah.
We have more community, we have more people that we know and interact with and all that. And then what does it do if things go really horrible sideways? It certainly make it far better then. So
Hmm.
it's an investment in each other. And it's interesting. I've long said that the world is balkanizing, like it's kind of breaking and fracturing, and people are like I think so much of what some of the pushback of the Middle East with like the United States being in the Middle East, I think, I'm not a foreign affairs expert, but it's this culture from outside being foisted upon a group of people. And they're like, I don't want it. Like we don't want this. And so
Hmm.
there's a pushback, and oftentimes a really vigorous pushback. And when you look at all the different values, and I know some people will say, I'm going to say there's a lot of different values and sensibilities and whatnot within the United States, and some people will say, yeah, you're either racist or not racist, and all the that's it. And
Yeah.
but I would actually posit that there's a lot more distinction within that. We have big Hispanic groups, and we have African American groups, and we have inbred Appalachian white groups, and then we have highly successful Dutch heritage groups in Michigan and Minnesota and all this stuff. There's a lot of different stuff, and we've kind of been able to hang together more or less with this idea of being Americans. The idea of being American now seems to be kind of passe. Maybe we'll revisit that. Maybe we
Yeah.
won't. But there is kind of a reality that the people out your back door and in your community are your neighbors, and those are the people that will ultimately kind of make this stuff work or not. And so it could be a really good thing going forward. Like maybe we end up with a globally networked food production system that is locally produced, but we do some global distribution where and when that makes sense. Like I'm a big fan of global trade. I just think things could be smarter. Maybe governance happens much more at the local level, which I think would be great.
Absolutely, yeah.
If my mayor is fucking up, I will go break his kneecaps. And there's transparency there. Whereas like, who do you go to in Washington D.C. to break their kneecaps when everything's going sideways? Like there's just so much more accountability at a local level, and I think that this is something that the American progressive left doesn't appreciate about Europe. Far more of the governance happens at the local level than at the what we would call the federal level. Like they do much more at the municipal and kind of the state level than what is done here. It's much like American healthcare. Like we have done everything as backwards as you could possibly do it
Oh yeah,
to
yeah.
make it functional, So there could be kind of a golden age on the end of this. It's just I think there's going to be some rough sledding to get there. Quite frankly,
Right.
maybe not, but I think it could be. Yeah.
Right. Well, it's the whole deal with the national debt too, which it sounds irrelevant, but I'll tie it in. Um, the reason why we never have interest rates go up and no one ever wants to take on the national debt is because there is going to be so much short-term pain with that,
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to have to tell people, look, this bubble's going to have to deflate, all your assets are going to go down. Um, Everyone's going to have to default on debt. People who lent loans out, you guys aren't going to get made whole. Like this whole house of cards has to collapse. But in the wake of that, now we get to be a real country again
Well,
where,
and it could be a soft landing
right.
with some preparation and
Oh,
planning, or
absolutely.
you just wait for it to
Well,
rattle down on its
well, right,
own.
right.
Yeah.
But essentially, what we do is we just kick the can down the road. As anytime a crisis happens, we push interest rates lower, just so that way you could pay everybody and shut them up for the crisis being. Um, but once again, no one wants to have it happen on their watch.
Right.
Oh, well, the next president can deal with pulling out of Afghanistan. The next president can deal with this. The next president can deal with that. And I think we're running out of road to kick the can down, because, we're starting to see inflation now, right? Well, when you print 40% of all currency in existence within a year, prices tend to go up. And then that was under a Republican president, right? They're supposed to be financially conservative, although Trump definitely wasn't. Now we have a Democrat in the House. They'll straight up tell you, oh, the stuff's paid for. $3 trillion stuff is paid for. Yeah. Well, by who? By the Federal Reserve that just printed the money into existence. All right. Well, now we're going to be paying for that inflation. So the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, it's funny. He said inflation was transitory. Well, he was absolutely right. It's transitory to higher inflation.
Well, the planet is transitory. It was created, and at some point, the sun will explode and consume it. I mean, it's
Right.
like, what the fuck does that even mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just a dodge in the bullet, because once again, they don't want it to fall apart on their watch, but eventually you just have no more room to push it. And then, either you default honestly and tell them, look, we'll bargain with you, but dude, we ain't paying you back all this money. Or you hyperinflate and then you pay them back in currency that doesn't, get them anything. Or you go to war with them, which I've heard people, joke about. Oh, we should just go to war with China. We should go to war with Russia. Do you like understand what that means? Do you understand what that looks like? Are you really that fucking dense that you don't understand? There's like millions of people will die, and hey, we're sending them debt, and they're giving us bad deals, so we should go to war with them. Like, just bid on that for about 5 minutes and tell me if that makes any sense. But we're not in a good place in this country, and that's very, very sad, because we all know what it could be, and everybody knows there's kind of something wrong, but no one's putting out the right solutions. And obviously, with the current administration, we're not going to see any of that, because they're more worried about climate change, which, you wrote, I don't want to say wrote a whole book on it, but, you kind of pulled the thread on that a fair shake. And
Yeah.
um, it's just sad, because I want to be optimistic, and I am optimistic, but it's like the short-term pain associated with all the solutions, it's going to hurt. But, you got to go through the withdrawal from heroin to become, no longer an addict.
Yeah. And I guess there's some smart things written and said about the life cycle of empires and stuff like that, and the life cycle of democracies, and we might just kind of be there. We may to some degree be the victims of our own success.
Absolutely.
There is absolutely income disparity and wealth disparity and everything in the United States, but it's less than virtually any society that you can
Right.
imagine, other than going back to like hunter-gatherer times. You have to feudalistic humanity, which is what most of humanity has existed in. Like the Gini coefficient is, like 95% of the wealth was held by like 5% of the people, and
Yeah.
now it's kind of a 40% thing, which is good for kind of like a civilization, but it's also good to the point that people can get lazy and cranky and lose sight of the things to be grateful for. And
Right.
so I don't know, maybe we fucked up. Maybe this is just part of, on a fractal level, in this kind of like living organism kind of scenario. This is just kind of the process that societies go through. They become very, very successful. There's a lot of success comparatively.
Mm.
That leads to a downfall, and then maybe something good can come out of that. The thing that concerns me is like what passes for Western liberal democracies so far has been a once in history event. Like what is defined like most of Europe, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, former British Commonwealths and whatnot. I guess India is kind of heading towards that Western liberal democracy to some degree, although the Hindu nationalism is kind of heavy and kind of interesting. But it only happened once, and it had never happened before. And like there would a fair number of the libertarian leaning people, they were like, oh, if we help China industrialize and get more capitalistic, they'll open up on a governmental level. That didn't happen. Like from an evolutionary perspective, the optimum might be transitory bouts of capitalism and socialism controlled by a government that isn't elected, that is totalitarian and can stay in office for 30 years so they can plan everything and not have an every 4 year, turnover cycle. Like that might evolutionarily be much more optimized for success within that context. I think it'd be a very dehumanizing world to live in that scenario,
Mm-hmm.
but that might actually be the default mode of what is optimum for human governance.
Yeah. Man, that's it's weird to
Oh,
think
I'm
about.
not the
Yeah.
person to talk to if you want to like sleep well at night and stuff. Like I'm just
Yeah. Well, I've kept you for a lot longer than I thought I would.
well, we got to talk something besides protein, carbs, and fat. So I actually got kind of giddy about chatting outside of my lane. So
Yeah,
yeah,
well, Rob, you need to stay back in your lane. So, when I release this, I'm gonna make sure I chop all this out and I'll just
perfect.
burn it or
Good
something.
call. It's probably smarter that way. So
No, man, yeah, it was awesome. And every single time I've heard you talk about the forbidden topics, I'm like, he has a good perspective on it. And like I said earlier, it's just because COVID's dragged this all out of us. And it's because the government's so big and in every facet of our life that now we don't have any choice but to pay attention to it and find some kind of solution. I don't claim to have all those answers. I have some ideas that I think will be good overall. I don't know if they'll work. I hope they will. Um, let's end on a positive note. You,
I think your point about focusing on the local level, that's a win coming and going. It'll make our lives better
oh,
today.
absolutely, yeah.
And if we dodge this bullet and we're able to pull things back together, it'll still be good. And then if things get squirrely, that is definitely, people will do that anyway. But if you start enacting, systems of decentralized food distribution and reconnecting with your folks in your local area, it's going to be better without a doubt.
Absolutely. Um, you're kind of doing that with the Healthy Rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
So let's kind of wrap it on that. How's the Healthy Rebellion doing? And do you see a lot of hope in that people are kind of improving their own lives and improving the lives of them around them?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think about, so it's got about 1,500 members, and I think that's about as big as you could get a community like that and not have it start eating itself. The
Sure.
fact that there's a paywall, it keeps some of the riffraff out. So I think the people who show up there they're just more invested. We have some kind of community guidelines. We don't need political memes. Like there's literally a billion places to do
To shit post,
your
yeah.
yeah. It's just like do that elsewhere. But we do have some rules of engagement around talking about like COVID, world events, like are we going to go to war with Russia and stuff like that. And we have it's almost like a debate team in high school, like where we have some rules of
Mhm.
engagement around it. Hey, I have this thing, and you lay it out, and then people can interact. So there's a little bit of guidelines to keep the just keep people kind to each other. We can have very vigorous debates and disagreement, but no,
Don't be a
it removes
dick.
the name calling. Don't be a dick. We're actually here to try to learn and move something forward, and it's worked really well. The interesting thing about that is that specifically isn't going to scale, but what's been happening in there is the people in the rebellion get this information, then what they're doing at their local community level, a church, a VFW, whatever, they're getting meetings put together where they end up talking to people about canning food and hunting and backwoods medical treatment, like survival medicine and stuff like that, and they're
Mhm.
they're getting groups together. And so if there's this one gal, Rachel, who's really good at like food preparation, canning, and a bunch of other stuff, and she's been doing these meetings where she helps her neighbors figure out how to do this stuff. And oftentimes they're kind of older people, but they missed that. We're like, our grandparents were very savvy with that. There's this generate 2-3 generations of people that don't know how to do these things. So I am seeing this. It's an online place where you can get a lot of information, a lot of good support, but then people are going back to their local communities and doing good work with that. But it's kind of on them, and it's based around their interests. And oftentimes what they do is they're like, I don't know how to work on a car. Hey man, I'm going to show you, like, I'm good with archery, so can we trade some archery time? And then you run me through my car and how can it get broken, and how do I, the basics of fixing it, like changing the brakes or whatever.
Yeah.
And people are doing some stuff like that.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And it is, I do find it to be a chain reaction where if one person does the best for themselves, then other people see that. And not always, but sometimes the consequence of that is, hey, maybe I need to get my ass in gear too. So that's awesome that you built that kind of community. I'm glad that it was cathartic for you to kind of get to talk a little bit more about the forbidden topics than normal. I'd love to have you back on sometime and we could keep kind of tagging on this stuff. Um,
I'll
this
bring down
was
property values anytime you want me to come on. So
uh,
you call it and I'll do it. Yeah.
well, I don't think we can get down to a negative property value, so it's always appreciated, brother. Go ahead, tell everybody where they can find you.
RobbWolf.com is kind of the main place. And like if you're contemplating nutrition change or whatnot, I've got a ton of free guides on there. I don't even think I ask people for their email. It's shopping and dining out guides, how to cook and prepare simple meals at home. There's just a ton of freebie material on RobbWolf.com.
Nice. Well, all in Liberty and Health listeners, go check that out. Pick up your element because that stuff is awesome, especially if you're fasting. That will be a game changer. And until next time, everybody, take care.